Okay, the gamete fight is blank and makes the blank. What do you think, A?
No.
Huh?
Oh, no.
Gamete is diploid, right?
This one is haploid.
I know gamete is haploid.
Well, gametophyte produces gametes, then it's D. I have it written down here.
Alright, anybody else? Last chance to question? Alright, so this terminology, we have the gametophyte, we have the sporophyte.
That's D.
Gametophyte is always haploid. Gametophyte makes gametes. Sporophyte is always diploid. Sporophyte makes spores. So the correct answer here was D.
I knew it.
Most of you got the gametes and the spores part, but the haploid diploid is still a little bit confusing. Remember, gametophyte is haploid, gametophyte makes gametes, sporophyte is diploid, sporophyte makes spores, okay? So we already looked at bryophyte alternation of generations, we looked at fern alternation of generations. We're moving on to the seed plants. So remember, in the seed plants we have our two major divisions. We have the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. We're going to look at an example of each of those types of seed plants and look at how alternation of generation works in those types of seed plants. So we're going to start with the gymnosperm. All right, so here's the life cycle of a gymnosperm. I'm just getting over a thing. So you can kind of see, it's a little bit hard to see on the screen here, but there's a little dividing line. Here. So looking at this diagram, start up here. What do you guys think is the gametophyte in a gymnosperm?
Dude, I think it's a cone.
Yeah, because that's what produces the gamete.
The pollen is the sporophyte. It may be the tree though. No, the tree is a sporophyte.
Yeah.
The pollen is the spores.
All right, click in if you haven't clicked yet.
But you like
I think it's cones.
Anybody else? All right, last chance to click. I'm about to turn it on. Okay. So, what did we just say about the gametophyte? Haploid or diploid? Haploid. Gametophyte is always haploid. This little dividing line here, you see the N and the 2N? This indicates this half of the dividing line is haploid. This half of the dividing line is diploid. So over here on the diploid side, we have the tree. We've got the cones. We've got the seed. Those are all diploid structures. So none of those can be the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is actually the pollen grain and the megaspore, which is contained within the cone. But the cone itself is actually diploid and is part of the spore. So the way this works, you've got your tree. In gymnosperms, they produce not flowers, but cones. And so you've got your tree, which is a sporophyte. Your tree is going to have two different types of cones, male cones and female cones. The male cones are smaller and softer. The female cones are larger and woody. So next time you're near a pine tree or a fir or something, you'll actually notice these two different types of cones on the tree. Particularly, the male cones are mostly out in the spring. So the male cones are going to produce the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grain. The female cones are going to produce the female gametophyte, which is the megaspore. All right, and so the megaspore is actually, if you look at the scales on these cones, that megaspore is going to be nestled between two of the scales of the cone, kind of down in the little gap there. The male cones are going to produce huge amounts of pollen. I'm very allergic to pine trees, so I am a little bit resentful of all the pollen they produce. So those are actually in between the scales on the male cones as well. So the pollen then, how does the pollen Are bees going around the
Is
pine
it
trees?
wind?
No, so how do they get there?
Wind?
Wind. So this is a wind pollinated plant, and the pollen's gonna go up into the air, it's gonna drift around. Usually the female cones have some sticky sap on the outside. The pollen grain will stick to the outside of the cone, and then it'll actually grow what's called a pollen tube. And that pollen tube will penetrate into where the megaspore is located, and the sperm will actually go down the pollen tube. They'll get in there, they'll fertilize the egg that the megaspore produces, because remember, gametophytes make gametes. So the sperm is the gamete for the pollen grain, the egg is the gamete for the megaspore. Sperm's gonna fertilize it, create the zygote, which is gonna be inside the seed, and then that seed will germinate into a new sporophyte. All right, questions about that? Kind of make sense, more or less? So the gametophyte is even tinier. So remember in the bryophytes, the gametophyte was the big green thing. In the ferns, the gametophyte was a tiny little leafy thing. Now the gametophyte's not even photosynthetic. It's even smaller, but it still has more than one cell. It's still multicellular, okay? All right. So that's gymnosperms. So let's move on now. Oh, sorry, I have all this stuff there. If you've got the slides, you can see that. So, I think I said all of the stuff, except that there's 2 ovules on each scale, and then those ovules contain the megaspores, which produce the egg. I think I said everything else that's there. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on then to the angiosperms. The angiosperms are the flowering plants. Angiosperm reproduction, gymnosperm reproduction is quite similar, but the ovules in the angiosperms are completely encased in a tissue from the sporophyte, which is a tissue that's called the carpel or the ovary, and that actually will develop into a fruit. So the flowering plants have flowers and they also have fruits, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All right, so let's talk a little bit about flowers. In the gymnosperms, you had male cones and female cones. Most angiosperms, both the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte are produced by the same structure, which is the flower. So the flower is actually what houses the gametophyte generation. If you look at a typical flower, it's organized into 4 layers. Those 4 layers are called whorls. The outermost whorl is the sepals. Sepals are these leaf-like structures that protect the developing flower. So if you imagine like a rosebud and it's got those little green things that are coming up around the edges, those are the sepals. So these are the sepals here. The next whorl in is the petals. Petals are usually, the purpose of petals is usually to attract pollinators, but there are some exceptions to that. So those 2 parts of the flower are not producing the gametophyte. The next whorl inside the petals is the stamens. The stamens produce the male gametophyte. So on each stamen, this is the stamen here, on each stamen you have what's called a filament, that's just the stem that supports the anther. The anther is what's going to produce the male gametophyte. Again, like in the gymnosperms, the male gametophyte is the pollen grain, and that's produced in the anther. So if you think about a really good one, if you think about like tiger lilies, they've got those really big anthers on them that if they drop onto your tablecloth, they dye it orange. That's the pollen that's dyeing your tablecloth orange. So that's the male gametophyte there being produced by the anther. On the innermost whorl, you have the carpel. That carpel is made up of 3 structures: the ovary at the base, the style, which is the stem thing, and the stigma, which receives the pollen. The ovary contains the ovule. The ovule produces the female gametophyte, which again is the megaspore. So the megaspore is produced within the ovule, which is within the ovary, which is part of the carpel. All right, does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at that same kind of, oh, it's dead. No, it's not dead. It's almost dead. I really need to change the batteries on this thing. Same kind of diagram that we've been looking at here. So we've got the diploid phase. The diploid phase, of course, is your sporophyte. We've got the haploid phase. The haploid phase is your gametophyte. So if you start with your plant, your flower here, The anthers are gonna be producing the male gametophyte, those are gonna be pollen grains. The, within the ovary is the ovule, it's gonna produce the female gametophyte, that's the megaspore. Pollen grains are going to get to the stigma. How might pollen grains, in the case of a flowering plant, how might pollen grains get to the stigma?
Pollinators?
You could have an animal pollinator. So if you have an animal pollinator, then you have some sort of symbiotic relationship between that pollinator and the plant, where usually the pollinator is getting something out of it and the plant's getting something out of it. So it's usually a mutually beneficial relationship. There are also wind-pollinated angiosperms. For example, the grasses are flowering plants. Grasses are flowering plants, but they are wind-pollinated, not pollinator-pollinated. And have you guys think about a grass flower?
Dandelion?
Nope, that is not a grass. That they just grow in grass. But think about the flower on a grass. Like think about wheat. What's the flower on wheat? Yeah, that seed head, which produces a whole bunch of pollen, right? Before the seeds start to form. So it doesn't really look like a flower, but that's because it doesn't have petals. So the function of petals is to attract a pollinator. If you're wind pollinated, you don't really need petals. So they don't have very much in the way of petals. It still counts as a flower though. All right, so pollen gets to the stigma. Like the gymnosperm, there's a pollen tube that grows. It'll grow all the way down the style and around to the bottom of the of the ovary, get in there, and it will in the angiosperms there's something that's a little bit different. So there's actually two sperm that travel down the pollen tube. One of those sperm will fertilize the egg. The other sperm actually fertilizes this other cell here that actually has two nuclei. These are called the polar nuclei. So that second sperm cell will fertilize the polar nuclei and create a triploid, because we have two nuclei from the mother plant, one nucleus from the father plant, and so you form this triploid structure, which becomes the endosperm. And the endosperm in flowering plants is part of the seed, and it provides nutrition for the developing embryo. Okay. So we have what we call double fertilization. One of the sperm fertilizes the egg, the other sperm fertilizes the polar nuclei and creates the endosperm, which feeds the embryo. Okay? Questions about any of that? Okay. So the major difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms is the presence of the flower, presence of fruit, and which are only present in the angiosperm, and then also this double fertilization where you have the triploid endosperm in the angiosperm. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. All right, so that moves us on to our next topic. So we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about particularly flowering plant reproduction, because flowering plants are the dominant type of land plant that we have. And so we're going to go into a bit more detail about exactly what's going on with flowering plants. So the flower, of course, is the reproductive structure in the plant. So next time somebody brings you a bouquet of flowers, they're bringing you a bouquet of plant genitalia, which I find very amusing. It actually maybe that is romantic. I don't know. There's a lot of diversity in flower structure. All of these flowers, all these flowers are very showy and very colorful and have large petals. That suggests that these are probably not wind-pollinated plants. So let's go again. Let's review flower structure. I know we just talked about this. This is technically the next lecture. So in theory, this wouldn't have been on the same day as the last slide. So we'll just do a quick review. Which part of the flower houses the male gametophyte?
Stamen, right? I love flowers. They're cool. That one, the orange and yellow one. This one? No, it's that one, yeah. Verbena. I love that.
All right, click in if you haven't clicked yet. yeah, the stamen is the part that has the male gametophyte. The carpel is the part that has the female gametophyte. A flower that has all four whorls, so it has sepals, petals, stamens, and a carpel, those are the four different whorls of a flower, is called a complete flower, okay? Most flowers do have all four whorls, but some of them are missing some of the whorls. So for example, grass flowers often are missing petals, so that would not be a complete flower, because it's missing the petals. If you are missing either the male structures or the female structures, then we have different terminology. So a perfect flower has both male and female parts. So it's producing both pollen and a megaspore. Imperfect flowers have either male parts or female parts. This flower up here, this is an example of a perfect flower. This is the carpel here, with the stigma, the style, and the ovary. These are stamens here with the anther on the filament. So this flower has both male and female parts. These flowers are imperfect flowers. This flower has only female parts. So this is the stigma here, the style, and the ovary. This flower has anthers on filaments, but so this flower is only a male flower. Okay, that makes sense? Now, the next question is whether you have male and female flowers on the same plant. So some plants are called monoecious plants. A monoecious plant has both male and female flowers on the same plant. So it has distinct male and female flowers, but both of them are present on the same plant. Mono means one, and then this ecious is referring to a house. So you have one house, you have males and females in one house. So this is a male flower, this is a female flower, male flower, female flower. They're distinctly male and female, but they're present on the same plant. In contrast, other flowers are what are called dioecious flowers. Dioecious means two houses. In this case, you can have male and female flowers, but they are present on different plants. So the whole plant is either male or female. Okay? That make sense? All right. Most plants have perfect flowers. Actually, shoot, there was a clicker question. You just heard me, so if you were listening, you get a clicker point.
So it's perfect.
All right, click in if you haven't clicked. Almost everybody was listening to me. But not quite. Hermaphroditic flowers, those are perfect flowers. Most plants, about 80% of plants in the world, have hermaphroditic flowers. That means that they're producing both male and female gametophytes. That means that in theory, it's possible for them to fertilize themselves, right? If you're producing both pollen and megaspores, you can fertilize yourself. You can, produce pollen, put it on the stamen, and there you go. Or on the stigma, and you're good to go. However, most plants avoid doing that. So we got a kind of a talk to your neighbor question here. Why should a plant avoid mating with itself? What's better about mating with someone else?
I was about to say that. Good job.
It's so that you have variation that never happens. You have
Yeah, wiped out. We are all the same person. We're all gonna get sick.
All right, what do you guys think? Genetic diversity, that's a big one. So if you mate with yourself, you are only going to be passing on your genes to your offspring. That actually might be a good thing in some cases if you're in a very homogeneous environment. But a lot of times the environment is variable, and so it's beneficial for your offspring to have higher genetic diversity. Why else might you not want to mate with yourself? Huh? Competition. I try necessarily be a bad thing. Yeah.
If you're special, your kids will be special.
Do you mean like, if you have,
If you asexually reproduce just to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think maybe what you're getting at there is if, let's say you have a deleterious gene, and you're heterozygous for it. If you mate with yourself, a quarter of your kids are gonna be homozygous for that deleterious gene. So there's a fitness advantage to mating with somebody else. So it does increase the genetic variability of your offspring, and it could potentially improve the fitness of your offspring if you have some harmful genes in your genome. All right, so let's talk about how plants avoid mating with themselves. Because you're a plant, right? You don't have a brain. You can't just like decide not to mate with yourself. There are some strategies that plants employ to avoid mating with themselves. So one thing you can do is you can spatially separate the male and female parts of the plant. You can separate the male and female parts of the plant in time. And then there's also some genetic mechanisms. We're going to go through each of these. So here's an example of spatial separation. This is the reproductive structure of like a hibiscus flower. If you guys have ever seen a hibiscus flower. These guys are pollinated mostly by bumblebees. And what happens is that the bee comes in, it lands on the tip of this thing. These are where the stigma are. Okay? This is the female reproductive area here. And then it walks down the stem to where the nectar is at the base of the flower, right? So, and then when it leaves, it just flies away. It doesn't walk back out to the end of the stem again. So what happens is that bee lands, it's presumably coming from another flower. If there's any pollen on it, it's going to drop off that pollen from the other flower on these female structures. So that's good, because this flower is getting fertilized. And then it's going to walk through here and pick up a bunch of pollen, and then it's going to fly away and hopefully go to another plant and bring that pollen with it. So because it hits the female part first, if the male parts were out here and the female parts were back here, and the bee landed, it would pick up pollen and then it would just pollinate the same flower, and that wouldn't work. So having the female parts on the tip helps to increase the probability that the pollen that gets delivered to those female parts is actually from a different flower. Does that make sense? So that's an example of spatial separation. Temporal separation, or separation in time. This is a magnolia flower. Have you guys heard of magnolias? Yeah. It's a big tree that grows out on the East Coast, and they have these enormous, very fragrant flowers. When the magnolia flower first opens, the female parts are mature. So it can receive pollen. The male parts are still immature, so it's not producing pollen yet. So anything that comes to that flower when it first opens is going to deliver pollen, presumably from somewhere else, and it's not going to pick up any pollen, so it's not going to self-pollinate itself because it's not producing pollen yet. Then, after it's been open for a few days, if it's been successfully fertilized, these female parts will shrivel up, and the plant will start producing its own pollen. So now any pollinators that visit are going to pick up pollen, but these have already been fertilized so that it's not going to be pollinating itself. That make sense? Okay, so that's temporal separation. The last one is a genetic incompatibility, or self-incompatibility. And this actually takes advantage of the growth of the pollen tube. So remember, during reproduction, the pollen lands on the stigma, and it has to grow that pollen tube all the way down the style to the ovary. In this case, what happens is that you have pollen tubes. If a pollen grain lands on a plant that it has the same genes in the pollen grain as in the plant will actually block the growth of the pollen tube, so it'll prevent fertilization. So in this case, if you have a plant, this is its genotype, so cast your minds back to population genetics. These are the self-incompatibility gene. This is the self-incompatibility gene. There's multiple alleles. So this plant, this adult sporophyte, which is diploid, has 2 copies of this self-incompatibility gene. what kinds of gametes can you produce if you have S1 and S2 as your alleles?
S1 and S2?
S1 and S2, right? So this is the type of pollen that this plant can produce. Because the alleles match what's in the sporophyte, pollen tubes from these pollen grains will not grow on this plant, okay? So it's incompatible, so it will not fertilize itself. It's incapable of fertilizing itself. Now, suppose you have this pollen from the same plant gets to this plant. This plant is a relative. It has one allele that's the same and one allele that is different, right? So this pollen grain that is S1 that matches is going to be blocked. But this pollen grain that is S2 will be allowed to grow, okay? And so in this case, you can produce two different types of offspring, S2, S1 offspring, because S2 can fertilize the S1 allele, or S2 can fertilize the S3 allele. So you have two different possible types of offspring. All right? What about this case? Can these pollen grains grow? Yes. In this case, because the sporophyte is S3, S4, neither of these pollen grains match, so they can both grow. Right? So what kinds of offspring can you make?
S3, S1,
S3, S1,
S3, S2,
S3, S2, S1, S4,
and S2, S4.
S1, S3, I think is the one I haven't said
You
yet.
can produce any.
These ones. What do you notice about all of these genotypes? Do you guys remember the words homozygous and heterozygous? What do you notice about all those genotypes? They're all heterozygous. So when you have this self-incompatibility, it prevents the formation of homozygous plants at this particular gene. So you only have heterozygous plants. This is a form of disassortative mating, if you remember that from way back in the day when we were talking about evolution. A form of disassortative mating, okay? Any questions about that? All right, so that's 3 ways that plants can avoid mating with themselves. All right, so regardless, you got to get your pollen from one place to another, especially if you want to mate with someone else. And actually, a lot of plants, they would prefer to mate with someone else, and so they'll actually try to avoid pollinating themselves at first. Obviously these plants aren't thinking about anything because they don't have brains, but there are a lot of flowers that when they open, the pollen and the stigma are very far apart, but if they don't get fertilized as they wilt, the stigma will actually bend down to where the pollen's at. Because it's better to mate with yourself than to mate with no one. So they'll mate with themselves as the last resort, but preferably you want to mate with someone else. You've got to get your pollen from one place to another. And so the 2 major ways that angiosperms are doing that are either through wind pollination or through animal pollination. So I'm going to show you guys some different flower types. Because you can by looking at the flower, you can tell a lot about how a plant is being pollinated. So for example, these are all flowers. Do these look like flowers to you?
No.
Not really, right? What do you think is pollinating these? These are all wind-pollinated flowers. So this is an alder, this is a grass, this is a, I think that's an elm, and these are some sedges. Sedges have edges. One of my random jobs that I had at one point in time was caring for the sedge collection at the university where I got my PhD. So I know a stupidly large amount of stuff about sedges, which is ridiculous because they're like the most boring plant ever.
What is a sedge?
A sedge looks like a grass, but it's not a grass. Sedges have edges and rushes are round.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like grass, but it's not a grass. Anyway, but all of these are wind pollinated. If you're wind pollinated, you don't need to produce nectar to attract a pollinator. You don't need to have petals to attract a pollinator. You just need to produce a crap ton of pollen, because if you're relying on the wind, you got to get a lot of it out there to be blown around to land on another flower. That's basically it. You just got to produce a crap ton of pollen. So most of the plants that people are really, really allergic to, like ragweed and all of that grass pollen and a lot of the trees that that people are super allergic to, mostly wind pollinated plants. And the reason we've developed allergies for these plants is because there's so much of their pollen floating around in the air, and then your immune system decides that it needs to massively overreact to having pollen grains in your sinuses. So those are some wind pollinated ones. Let's take a look at some animal pollinated ones. So for bee pollinated flowers, flowers that are especially for bees, they often have relatively large tube-shaped flowers that a bee can crawl its whole body into, and they often have little landing pads with dots on them. This attracts the bee and tells the bee where to go. So the bee flies in, it lands on this landing pad, and it crawls into the back of the flower, and there's a nice sugary treat in the form of nectar back there. And different flowers have the male parts at various places, and they'll deposit pollen in different places on the bee. What does the bee get out of this relationship?
Nectar?
Nectar. So the bee's getting food. What does the plant get out of this relationship?
It's
Pollination. So both the plant and the pollinator are benefiting from this relationship. Okay. It's what?
Isn't it symbiotic?
It is symbiotic, although symbiotic literally just means living together. Not all symbiotic relationships are mutually beneficial. This would be what we call a mutualism. A mutualism is a mutually beneficial relationship. There are other plants that are pollinated by flies. In the case of fly-pollinated plants, they often look and smell like rotting meat or poop. So they tend to have this very dark red color that will attract the flies, but the same thing, the fly comes in and it gets a little pollen on it and then eventually goes to another flower. There's a lot of birds that feed on nectar. Bird-pollinated flowers tend to have very long, skinny flowers that a bird can stick its beak into, and then it sticks its tongue out of its beak and drinks the nectar that way. Hummingbirds, which you guys are probably familiar with, are the primary nectar-feeding birds in the Americas. There are no hummingbirds in any other part of the world. They're exclusively an American birds. We have them in North America and South America. But there are no hummingbirds in Africa, there are no hummingbirds in Australia, there are no hummingbirds in Europe. They're only found here. So they're kind of cool. But those other continents do have nectar-feeding birds. This is an Australian honey creeper feeding on nectar. This is an African. That one is a...
They never look so
I forget. This is a sunbird. What I want you to notice about all of these birds is if you look at their beaks and you look at the shape of the flower they're feeding from, their beaks are very, very similar to the shape of the flower they're feeding from. So what do you think the flower for this guy looks like?
Pretty long.
Yeah, super long. So there are these specialized hummingbirds that feed primarily on one type of flower. And so this guy feeds on a very, very long, skinny flower that only he can get his beak into. So that means that that particular species of bird gets to monopolize all the nectar from that flower because no one else can get to it except for him. The flower, because that bird is only feeding from that particular type of flower, that means that pretty much all the pollen on that bird is going to be from that flower. So it's good for the flower, it's good for the bird. There are also a lot of things that are pollinated by bats. Bat-pollinated flowers tend to open at night, they tend to be very fragrant, and they tend to be white. Being white helps the bat find it in the dark, and being fragrant also helps the bat find it in the dark. So for example, the agave plant is fertilized by bats, which is why if you look on a bottle of tequila, a lot of times there's a picture of a bat on there, because you need to have bats in order to have tequila plants, or agave plants, which you make tequila out of. All right. No, bats are not blind. It depends on the species of bats. Some bats actually have relatively good sight, but bats are not. No bats are completely blind, but they don't use their eyes as much as other animals do. So their eyes are smaller, and they are not devoting as much as, depending on the species of bat, not devoting as much of their brain processing power to interpreting visual input. But like fruit bats, for example, they have big eyes because they're looking at the fruits. So it just depends on the type of bat. All right, what does this flower look like to you guys?
Bee?
It looks kind of like a bee.
however, do not give their pollinators any reward of any kind. In the warmer parts of Europe lives a whole group.
You turn up the volume on the YouTube video.
I'm working on it, I'm trying to get this damn thing out of the way.
A sexual one.
There we go, okay, we're doing it, throwing over more.
Some plants, however, do not give their pollinators any reward of any kind. In the warmer parts of Europe lives a whole group that bamboozle their pollinators into thinking that they're going to get a really sensational reward, a sexual one. They're little orchids, and their flowers reproduce remarkably closely the signals that enable a male bee or wasp to recognize a female of the same species. Several have blue patches. One is fringed with what looks like fur. A wasp's wings in the right light do flash iridescent blue, and its abdomen is covered with thick brown fur. A female wasp also pumps out an identifying perfume, but the orchid does the same, and the result is irresistible. As the male wasp nuzzles forward in his attempts to mate, he butts the pollinia which stick to him like yellow horns. He seems to be well aware that something has happened to him, but there's nothing he can do about it, and he flies off to try his luck elsewhere. Which, of course, is what the orchid requires, because this time he deposits the pollen on another bogus female. The hairs on many of these orchids run downwards, as though the female is sitting with her head up. But some reproduce her clinging head down, and then the male must land that way if he wants to mate, and he will get the pollen stuck to his rear. This one too seems fully aware that he's got rather more than he bargained for. The orchid's mimicry is so convincing and enticing that sometimes a flower will attract a whole scrum of sex-crazed suitors. Some are trying to get to the orchid and will inadvertently deliver the pollen. Other males, since there seems to be a full house, attempt to mate with one another.
So, I actually went to Spain last year and I found a few of these orchids and I was super excited. And I hung out by them for a while, but the wasps didn't come while I was there, is what he said. But, yeah, in this case, okay, so what is the orchid getting out of this? Pollination. What is the bee or wasp getting out of this? Nothing. So this is not a mutualistic relationship. This would be actually a parasitic relationship where the flower is taking advantage of the bee. But the bee, it's really hard for the bee to evolve to avoid the flower, because if you think about, if you're a bee, being picky about who you mate with is usually not something that's going to have a high fitness advantage. You want to mate with any possible female that you come across. And so it's very hard for the bee to escape from the flower taking advantage of it, basically. All right. Okay, so once you have your pollination, you have your fertilization. The other thing that's really important about angiosperms is the production of seeds. So remember, the seed it's unique to the seed plant. So both gymnosperms and angiosperms do have seeds. But seeds are really important for colonization of harsher environments because it allows the plant to create the embryo, and then the embryo can remain dormant for a period of time until it can germinate and then grow in favorable conditions. So, this is a cross-section of the seed. This bit here, the blue bit, that is the embryo that is in stasis and just waiting for a favorable environment. This is that triploid endosperm. This is the nutrition source for the plant when it first starts to grow before it can photosynthesize for itself. Seeds can remain viable for really long periods of time. They recently, this is actually really cool, I should put a slide in about this. They recently found some palm date seeds in an archaeological dig from about 2,000 years ago. And they were able to germinate those seeds, and they're now growing date palms. Dates are a type of fruit that people eat. They're growing date palms that were from like 2,000 years ago now, which I think is really, really interesting. And the trees are not mature enough yet that they produce any fruit, but they're very excited to see what these dates from 2,000 years ago actually taste like. So it allows the plant to survive for periods of time, which is really important for colonizing these harsh locations. Seeds come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. So some seeds also can help with dispersal, so getting away from the parent plant to a new location. So little seeds like these seeds might actually be blown around by the wind or things like that. But the other thing that angiosperms have that's really unique, and fruits are a structure, again, that often helps with seed dispersal. So fruits are derived from the ovary of the sporophyte. So they're not part of the offspring. They're actually produced by the parent plant. And then it's a way to help the offspring get to another location. A lot of fruits are sweet. Why do you think a fruit would be sweet?
Sugars from the,
Yes, but why are they putting sugars in there? Sugar is expensive.
so animals wouldn't it down?
Yeah, so an animal will eat it, hopefully go somewhere else and poop out the seeds in another location. So most of those sweet fruits, that is the function of the fruit, is to get an animal to eat it and carry that seed to another location. Not all fruits are sweet, so in the case of a pea plant, the fruit is actually the pod. So if you're eating like a sugar snap pea or a snow pea, that pod is the fruit. And not all pea pods are edible. In the case of something like a maple, this winged shape here is the fruit. The seed is contained in this portion, but what is this going to do? This winged airplane. Yeah, exactly. So this allows for wind dispersal of the seed.